Okay, well, dzień dobry. Good morning for me, good afternoon, evening, probably for pretty much the rest of the people who are watching this. Welcome to the session on securing IT against modern threats with Microsoft 365 security tools. My name is Michael Noel, and I'm based out of the San Francisco Bay Area. I was scheduled to be up in Warsaw for this originally. I'm still scheduled to come out in September, crossing fingers everything works out okay in the world, of course. Would love to be there. I've been to Poland a few times in the past, never to speak, so I'm excited about getting the opportunity to come out there and lead a session. But please, if you have the opportunity, and again, if everything goes okay, join us on September 12th up there at the Microsoft Poland offices. So thanks to the sponsors for organizing this event. Of course, without sponsors, we couldn't be doing events like this. So we really, really appreciate the help and sponsorship of the companies that were involved with this. So a little bit more about myself and what I do. I've been involved in the SharePoint world since around 2001, so since the original release of SharePoint. I actually wrote one of the first books on SharePoint, which was SharePoint Unleashed, and then over the years I kept that up to date. I actually even had one of my books published into Polish once. It's been a while, but I remember they send me different copies of language editions that are out there. So so there are a few Polish copies floating around there, not anything recent. But I'm fortunate enough to be able to speak around the world at different events. I created a little Power BI dashboard you can see in the background there, where I kind of overlaid some of the areas of the world where I've done events. Of course, unfortunately, it looks a little bit too similar to the COVID map, so I may be changing this. But in any case, it's been an honor and privilege to travel around the world speaking in different places, and I hope to add a little dot there in Warsaw after the September once I get there. Just in case you understand what my regular job is, I work at a consultancy based out of the San Francisco Bay Area, and we have a lot of different clients where I'll assist with setting up infrastructure, migration, and more recently I've been involved in doing a lot of work around the security aspect of it. So I've been heavily involved in working with these Microsoft security tools, and that's fundamentally why I did a presentation on this topic. So let's go ahead. One of the things that's really a bit concerning with modern IT is that it's become very, very difficult to get ahead of the attackers. Attackers have gotten much more sophisticated. They've had much more resources that are directed at them. And they've started to get much more specific in the way that they go about things. One of the things that we'll see oftentimes is what we call spear phishing attacks. And that's where you'll have an executive or someone who works within your finance department who's responsible for sending bank transfers. You'll have those people specifically targeted, where somebody with, a hacker with a lot of free time to do research on that individual will go out and find out everything they can about them. They'll find out if they have, personal passwords stored in dark web databases that have been hacked. They'll find out a bunch of information about them, about their home life, about their past. And the idea with that is that then they send these targeted attacks at those individuals to try to get them to give up their credentials. We actually saw recently at one client a very specific targeted attack at the managing director, what we call the CEO of that company, where it looked very, very similar to the type of messages that you would receive from Mimecast. In that case, they were using Mimecast, except that, of course, it went to a credential harvesting site where it was specifically trying to gather the credentials of that particular user. So obviously, when you get in on that level, on the executive level, or when you get in on the finance level, you can cause a lot of trouble. We actually even personally, I had somebody try to have my paycheck sent to a different bank account, and it was only caught because our own internal company at some point asked me a question about it, and I said I didn't authorize that. So, needless to say, even our organization has been occasionally caught unawares by those types of things. So spear phishing is a massive issue, trying to deal with that. State-sponsored attacks. You have states that are out there that will specifically go out and, let's say, hack an organization because they didn't like a movie that they made, which actually happened, or hack different. There's things like Sea Turtle, where specific environmental organizations were targeted just because of the work that they're doing. So we see that happening more and more often. Different governments are starting to gain a lot of experience in doing that, and of course, that means that there's a lot more money associated with these types of attacks. At the same time, we see a lot of things like intellectual property theft and loss. So you start to see mass downloads of data, or somebody who's been offboarded, fired from the company, pulling information off, downloading stuff that they shouldn't be, and taking it to their next place that they're working at, as well as what a lot of people underestimate, which is essentially oversharing of content. Someone accidentally sharing something outside of the organization they weren't supposed to. And that actually happens more often than the disgruntled sharing is. In fact, I've seen estimates of it being somewhere around 90% of all cases of information leaking out of the company is where someone just accidentally sends it out. So you may fully trust all of your users, but maybe they're not necessarily the most technically savvy. They share something, people get access to it, it's confidential data, and that causes issues. So we've seen that as well, specific attacks around that. Of course, a major issue right now is ransomware attacks. We've seen some major organizations get completely crippled because somebody gains access to, let's say, domain admin credentials within their organization and sends, goes across the entire network to every domain join system and encrypts it, throws away the key unless you pay up in cryptocurrency, for example. So that kind of thing happens. It oftentimes ends up in the entire organization needing to be rebuilt or recovered from backups. Hopefully you have backups. But that also leads to issues with organizations not necessarily having backup. We have great cloud-based applications out there. Office 365 is a wonderful thing, but by default, for example, Office 365 is not backing up your mail data. And there are methods that you can use to completely erase somebody's mail without having it go to the recycle bin. So that kind of permanent deletion of cloud data is actually starting to pop up as an issue, where you'll see organizations say, "Hey, I had this important person's mailbox completely emptied of content, and we can't recover it. How are we supposed to go back?" And well, if you don't have any backups on that, then you really don't have an option, because Microsoft's not backing that up natively. So we see that kind of permanent deletion of cloud data oftentimes associated with an attack, because that'll be part of either another ransomware attack or just specifically a destructive attack like the Sony hack would have been. Under device security, of course, we always have the issues of thefts and compromise of systems. So you'll have incidents where somebody loses their laptop. In particular, for example, in Silicon Valley, we have a bit of an issue where people break windows of cars and steal things out of the back. And we don't have a lot of crime, but we do have a lot of that kind of petty theft. So a lot of our clients deal with having to lock down machines on a regular basis. And then, of course, people trying to get the malware, the keyboard loggers, rootkits installed on machines. We'll see that happen all the time. That's of course not a new thing. But once you gain access, once you gain root to someone's systems, there's a lot of things that you can do. You can take a look at their webcam, see what they're doing. You can go in and reset passwords. You can then also, and this is an important thing to understand, anyone that has local admin on a domain join system can start to initiate attacks on cached credentials on that system. And this happens a lot, because this is essentially what's called a lateral attack. Is I gain access, I hack someone's personal corporate workstation, but maybe that person doesn't have any special rights. They just have a regular domain account, but they do have local admin on their box. That happens a lot. Programmers, other people may have local admin rights. Well, if you do that, and if at one point someone that was a domain admin or some other privileged admin logs into that machine, their credentials are cached there natively, and they're cached for a certain period of time. well, those can be brute force attacked if someone gains access to that system. So they can immediately go in, try to gain those credentials, and then do lateral attacks with those credentials. So we see that becoming more and more of an issue, so much so that you really need to kind of control any privileged account and reduce, for example, the lifetimes of the tickets that those accounts are allowed to have, and do some other maintenance and preventative steps for those accounts. At the same time, people in IT are overloaded with information. We've got a lot of data that's flying all over the place. You know, in many cases, you may even be alerted of these types of things. Your firewall may be sending out alerts. You know, you've got routers and other network equipment sending out syslogs saying, hey, it looks like I'm being hacked, or it looks like someone's doing this. But there's a huge, you know, noise to signal ratio. It's really difficult to understand what's pertinent and useful information. And trying to stay one step ahead of the attackers becomes really challenging because, of course, most organizations don't spend any money on IT security until they get hacked, which is unfortunate because oftentimes when they do get hacked, it becomes let's just say a CV generating event for a lot of people within that organization. And we've seen some pretty disastrous attacks happen where, you know, organizations just get flattened and have to start from scratch. You know, people are writing on paper, and, you know, we've had some city governments. I remember a case down in Texas where they had to do everything in paper because their computers were just essentially knocked offline for something like a week or a week and a half. So that fundamentally creates a problem. And at the same time, most people are behind in terms of the way that they think of things. Passwords, for example, are one area in which a lot of organizations don't really follow best practices. We're following the best practices from the 1990s in most cases. And the reality is that the problem is, in the past, you could create a fairly complex password. You know, you could get all tricky by replacing the A's with the ampersands and replacing the S's with a $sign. And people thought they were being all, you know, hey, I'm making this so that it's not going to be hackable. The problem is that there's a database out there of 877 million hacked passwords. Every password that's ever been hacked and stored in a dark web database is accessible to some of these hackers. And to be able to run a dictionary attack against a copy of a password that you can run multiple attacks against is fairly trivial. Modern machinery can actually do that in a matter of milliseconds. So, to give you one example, Microsoft even actually has some specific PowerShell commandlets that you can run against your domain controllers as a domain admin, of course. But what it does is it allows you to essentially copy off the entire password hash file and then run your passwords against those databases of all of those hacked passwords. And so what we end up seeing is that it's quite easy in most organizations. I would say it's somewhere around 50 to 60% of the passwords will fail that initial test. It'll go through and run every password within, let's say, 10 seconds or so in your organization, and then you get a result and you say, okay, these 60 people are using passwords that at some point were used as part of some kind of a hack that's out there. And what's especially dangerous is when the username of that individual is the same as their corporate username, which, let's be honest, happens all the time. You know, users can't, it's difficult for them. They go in and they need to sign up for service, particularly if it's a corporate type service and they don't have it integrated with your directory. Well, what do? You create I'm Bob at companyabc.com. And that happens to be the same as my corporate environment. And then guess what they do? 90% of the time, they use the same password that they're using for their internal corporate password. That's a recipe for disaster because now I have exactly what I need. Now I don't even need to do a dictionary attack. I can just go in, look for anybody at companyabc.com within those databases, and go and attempt to try to hack those particular users. So, what I usually recommend for our clients is, number one, make sure that the password you're using for your corporate password is unique. And that's important to put as part of a password policy. When you're telling people what to do, say, hey, make sure that this is only used within this corporation. At the same time, I try to encourage people to use passphrases, which, if a passphrase is basically several different words at once. I'm giving an example there: yellow bird seed, hat, pumpkin. You pick multiple things that you type in. It makes your password, as long as that's unique, that passphrase is unique, it makes it essentially impossible to run any type of brute force attack against, because it's long and complicated. So, even we even have organizations that are moving away from the concept of having people change their passwords every, let's say, 3 months or every 6 months, because realistically speaking, the password, as long as it's unique and as long as it's long enough, it's really, I don't want to say unhackable, but it's very, very difficult to hack at that point. So, so that's where you get into the situation where you can keep a password as long as it's unique for much longer, and you're not in the situation where you've forgotten what you changed your password to, because that happens all the time. It also happens to be that one of the most common passwords today, right now as I'm speaking, is Spring 2020, right? And I guarantee you the next most common password in a couple months will be Summer 2020. That's what people change their passwords to. They do it so that they can remember it. And it's hard to blame them, but we have to get away from that concept because it's so much easier to hack people. There is, by the way, a white hat database of these types of things. I put the link that's down there. You can test your passwords against that. I know some people are very cautious about throwing their passwords in that. That one, again, is white hat. Do be cautious about other ones that are out there. But there are known good databases. If you check within Microsoft, Microsoft will link to them as well, too. Lateral attacks, things that I mentioned, this is the kind of thing that that we're starting to see all the time in organizations. If you're not protecting against your lateral attacks, you will eventually get a ransomware attack. You will eventually have systems that are compromised. You will have data that is then leaked out of your organization. So like I mentioned, a lot of times that's cache credentials on workstations. It's a major issue. Other times it's you get a user, will take those credentials, will do that lateral attack, and will do something like creating what's called a golden ticket. Golden ticket is a really interesting attack. It's basically a Kerberos ticket that never expires. Normally, a Kerberos ticket expires after a certain period of time, but if you're a domain admin, you can create this golden ticket, which then will give you unfettered rights to all domain resources forever, because the ticket never expires. So even if someone goes through and, for example, resets the password on the KRBST account, it's still not going to change that ticket. You have to go and track down the ticket, revoke the ticket. There's this whole process to go through. So that's just one example, and that's where you really need, for example, tools that are looking for that type of activity that happens. And that's really where Microsoft's looked at this space and said, okay, we need to start to focus efforts on the creation of tools to help our customers to fix these types of issues, or to at least be able to identify them in advance, protect you against them, respond and recover from incidents that may occur. So I've kind of taken these Microsoft tools, I put them together into what's called the NIST cybersecurity framework. So NIST is the National Institute of Securities and Technologies. It's an organization here in the States, but it's used for a lot of cybersecurity type of operations. And the way that they view the cybersecurity is by tools where you can identify users, tools where you can protect, tools where you're detecting breaches within your organization, tools for responding to them, then tools for recovering. Now, there are some overlaps between these tools, but I kind of laid out the way that Microsoft sees these. If you're in a Microsoft-rich environment and you have access to a lot of these, depending on licensing, you may be able to then go through and take advantage of some of these tools. And that's a lot of the advice that we give to our clients is to take a look at what you have licensing-wise, because Microsoft does bundle many of these things together. Some of them are separate bundling and licensing, like Azure Sentinel, which we'll talk about. But other things like Cloud App Security, ATP, these come with different Office 365 and or Azure AD subscriptions. And I've got a licensing thread that I'll show as we get to the end of this presentation. All right, so I wanted to start with one of my favorite tools here. This is Microsoft's Cloud App Security. You'll see it abbreviated as MCAS sometimes. And what Cloud App Security does is it actually will work together with information received from your firewall and information from within your cloud tenancy to be able to tell you what people are doing within the organization and to be able to alert when people do things that that may be viewed as suspicious. So let me go right into Cloud App Security here because I've got it open in the background. This is a sample tenancy with Cloud App Security turned on, and they've created a few different sample alerts that are part of this. But you can kind of get a feel for the types of things you'll see in a full environment, which obviously for confidential reasons I can't show you one of my clients, but you'll have a lot more contextual information. You'll see a lot more people doing things. And one of the nice things about this is that Microsoft's actually done a pretty good job of reducing that signal to noise ratio. So if I'm helping a client out with their security throughout the day, or if one of our network security resources is doing that, we're only going to get a small handful of alerts throughout the day that we need to go through and investigate, as opposed to having to see a huge amount of alerts get pushed down to you. But you see in this case, we can see Megan has shared some customer data with different collaborators on the outside. Maybe she shouldn't have done this. Maybe we need to investigate to figure out what's going on. We can go through and resolve. We can adjust our policy to disallow her from doing that kind of thing. Or we can take a look at different types of activity that user has been doing. And a lot of times this will be part of that process. Is we go through and see, okay, what has that user been logging into? Does this look suspicious? Do I see activity that I wouldn't normally expect from a user like this? And again, you're getting a lot of contextual information about that user, about where they're logging in from, about the times that they're logging in. Again, obviously not too much into here, but you'll start to see different insights and information about the files that they're sharing, about the accounts that they're using. This is a list of everything that they've collaborated with. So that way I can kind of tell, is this a nefarious user who was upset at the company, or more likely, is it somebody whose account's been hacked? A lot of times we'll see that they get it hacked, and then someone starts to go through and look at company confidential information. Now, Microsoft maintains a catalog of all the different cloud applications that are out there, and they'll actually score those different applications based on how well they comply with certain criteria. So, of course, a lot of the Microsoft stuff is rated fairly highly. But even things from Cisco, AWS will be rated highly. If something comes in from an application which has a fairly low score, that's going to cause more alerts than other things. So if the system sees that someone has just downloaded a whole bunch of data and uploaded it to one of these systems that has a really low confidence, that will likely spin up an alert within the console, and we'll be able to tell what's going on with we'll be able to tell a little bit more contextual information about it. But again, a great tool from the perspective of being able to tell what's going on. This is actually me. I just logged into the organization here. Let's see if there's anything else more useful here. By the way, this of course ties into the contextual information that you're pushing into Azure AD. So when you have Azure AD connect into place, you can tie information about individual users in, including, for example, even their photos and the information about their managers and things like that. It helps you to go through and investigate issues a little bit more specifically. So one of the other things to note about this is one of the things Microsoft did in the past, I think it was around 8 months ago, is they started to integrate alerts from Azure ATP. Now, Azure ATP, which, by the way, doesn't work in the demo environment, or at least the integration piece of it, is actually a different tool, which I'll talk about a little bit more detail. But basically, it's pulling all that data into one location. So when we see the logins for the users like we saw earlier, we'll actually see their logins not only within the cloud, but also their logins on the domain controller and what resources they've been accessing internally from that ATP integration. Let me just go back into the slide here. which takes us to ATP. Now, in true Microsoft fashion, there's some confusion over the acronyms here. There's actually an on-premise version of ATP, which we honestly don't see that often, at least not with our client base. We're mostly dealing with the cloud-based version, which is Azure ATP itself. But Azure ATA, if you ever hear that talked about, that's an on-prem version. And it's the same concept. The concept with ATP or ATA is you deploy agents out to your domain controllers. And those agents sit on your domain controllers and they run they look for specific type of activity which they perceive to be certain types of threats. And then they do things like process logins. They see when people log into things. But they're looking for lateral attacks. They're looking for golden ticket usage. They're looking for the types of things that is not necessarily natively built into domain controllers. Those sensors need to be running, of course, all the time, and they need to be uploading their information into the console, either the ATA local on-prem console or ATP in most cases in the cloud itself. And then ATP itself will go through and notify you when there's a threat or when something's been accessed, and it triggers certain criteria that it's suspicious and not necessarily a good thing. So we use ATP in a lot of organizations that, of course, are licensed to do that. It does require, again, a deployment exercise of pushing out those sensors to domain controllers. But once those sensors are on the domain controllers, then you get some really rich contextual information about activity that's happening within your environment, which can then all be accessed from within the MCAS portal when you integrate your ATP and MCAS together. Microsoft calls that the Unified Security Portal. But when you gain access to that, then you can see everything and you can tie all the behaviors together. One of the, I'll tell you just based on experience, one of the biggest challenges to doing investigations is everybody is breathing over your neck. They're concerned that there's somebody hacked within your organization. People are yelling, saying, "Hey, should we shut everything down? Should we turn off the firewall? What's going on?" There's a lot of pressure. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have a bunch of different tools that you're trying to investigate things from. You want to go into one tool and say, "Hey, here's what's going on. I want to export this out to management so they can see everything that happened, export it out to CSV, send it over to this person. I want a single pane of view look at activities," and that's really what that portal does. That Unified Security Portal that provides the information from MCAS and ATP together into one location. Now, Microsoft also, by the way, to make things a little bit more confusing, there's something called, you'll see in the screenshot there, it says Windows Defender ATP. They actually renamed that to Microsoft Defender ATP because it actually has agents that run not just on Windows. There's Mac agents and there's Linux agents as well, too. That's a different service that also just happens to be called ATP, but that service runs as essentially like a malware agent. So it'd be kind of like your Semantic type of solution or McAfee or one of those other malware solutions that runs specifically on the desktops themselves. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit more detail. But one of the things I really wanted to talk about, because it's relatively new and it's also, I think, one of the more powerful tools that are out there, is this tool called Azure Sentinel. Now, we're starting to use this more and more often with our various clients here. But it's a SIEM. Okay, so that's essentially like a security aggregation tool that takes information and logs from multiple sources and then stores all those logs into one centralized location and then provides for a layer of intelligence on top of those logs. So if you were just storing logs, it's honestly just, for example, in Azure, they would call that a logs analytics workspace. You can just dump your syslogs or your domain controller logs into one location, and then you can run queries to search against them. But what Sentinel does is that it allows you to not just store those logs, but then to do a certain amount of incident reporting. It's got some dashboards in there that'll show you, malicious events, where they're coming from around the world. The clients that we have this in place, for example, one of the things we help them with is we actually will have the portal have the platform create a portal that the management can look at to show what are the malicious events, where are we being attacked from around the world. And that comes in this particular case, it comes from Palo Alto network firewall logs that are sent into Sentinel. but it also then will say, show me all the logins over the course of a period of time. Show me, which users are logged into critical access. Do we have suspicious processes? Other times, the security folks will go in and do hunting. And unfortunately, this isn't part of any demo environment that Microsoft has, and I can't show you an active Sentinel environment for confidentiality reasons again, but if you get a chance to demo it, at least, I know Microsoft allows for a free demo, the hunting aspect of it is just phenomenal. You'll see things, they'll go in and there's certain criteria of things that you're looking for. It'll say, these are people that have logged or have tried passwords, which, the percentage of passwords that's not their old passwords is really, really high. Therefore, maybe something's up, like they're trying, it's somebody trying to hack specific accounts. You can expect, for example, a user to use one of their old passwords, and Active Directory stores their old hashes of their passwords. You can expect that to happen fairly often. People do that. They enter in their old password. But if somebody's entering a lot of new passwords, it sometimes can indicate that they're trying to hack the system. So organizations that keep these in, that have Sentinel in place, what they'll do is they'll send all of their logs, their firewall logs, different router information, Windows logs, Linux logs. They all get sent up into the platform itself. And then it's, you've got a centralized location for not just alerting against what's going on right now, but also going back in time then and looking at all the logins that happen between a period of time. Most of what you pay with Sentinel is, incidentally, it's what's called log ingestion. So you're paying for the logs, all the logs that you're sending up into the platform per day. Let's say you're sending 60, 70 gigs of logs a day from all your domain controllers and your file servers. You pay most for that. You pay then a much smaller amount for retention. And you can retain your logs for a specified period of time. So if you want to keep them for 2 years, for example, so that you can go back in time and someone says, hey, show me everything that person accessed on these file servers, or every time they logged in, you can export out that data. It uses a language, a query language called Custo. So if you're familiar with that, it's actually a fairly powerful language that can be used to dive into more detail on this. So great tool, something to take a look at, chat with Microsoft on that. Okay, so I mentioned a lot of the problems with Azure AD, with passwords in general. And one of the reasons why there's issues with that is that the mechanism for passwords hasn't really changed since Windows NT. So when you're in a domain environment, you don't have a lot of flexibility in how you decide whether someone's password is good or not. So you have the ability to say, okay, I want it to be at least, let's say, 8 characters long. I want it to be a minimum of this day. I want it to be a maximum of this day. So you have that kind of stuff. But then you have something called complexity, which is 2 out of the 3 uppercase, lowercase symbols, etc. That's not very. That doesn't protect you from situations where someone makes the password that's password 1 with a capital P and dollar signs. Well, that can be easily cracked. Or one of their previous passwords, or worst case, a password that they used on a social media service that got hacked earlier. So how do you protect against that? Well, in the past, you would need a third-party solution, but there actually is now a Microsoft solution called Azure AD Password Protection that also runs as agents on internal domain controllers, and those agents on the internal domain controllers will enforce specific password policies. So, for example, if you want to restrict someone from using a previous, let's say, a password that was used on a known dark web database, you can actually go through and restrict that. Or you can go through and say, don't use any part of your name, don't use any part of the corporation name. You can get a lot more specific about it. Now, this does require you to have that DC agent running on any domain controller. If you did miss a domain controller, then someone could bypass that and change the password on that other domain controller, and then it's not enforced. So this enforces those password change protections at the level of the domain controller itself, as opposed to after the password has been modified. So you may still have existing passwords that are out there that don't comply with policies. And there's various approaches to doing that. You could expire out those passwords, or you could do various things to get people to forcibly change their passwords. Okay, I mentioned the people, the common scenario of somebody having their corporate password out on the dark web and someone attempting to log in as that user. It is unfortunately way too easy to do that nowadays, because the instant somebody at let's say again company ABC shows up in a new dark web database, the first thing that the script kiddies do is they attempt to log in to their cloud-based services using those credentials, and oftentimes it works. So one of the things, for example, MCAS does is MCAS will alert you to say, well, there was a new hack on this service called, I don't whatever, some social media service, and we noticed there are 5 different accounts from users that are using your domain name to log into that service. So it actually alerts you in advance, and you can go out and proactively tell those people, hey, and make sure you change your passwords and make sure they're unique and they weren't the same as the service, and maybe don't use your company accounts next, or the name of your company account next time when you're signing up for a service. But in any case, getting to where this affects multi-factor, your approach to blocking 99% of that, and this isn't just a number I pull out, this is actually Microsoft's going through and doing some research on this, is MFA. Because MFA adds that additional factor into it, that they don't just need your username and their password, but they also need a code to be able to log into your service. So that code is either sent via it can be sent via phone call, where there's a robot telling you what the number is. It can be sent via text message, or it can be sent via a mobile app, like a Microsoft Authenticator or a Google Authenticator app, or finally via, there's some various approaches as well, using key fobs and some hardware-based token types of setups. That's the order in which they're secure, by the way, because with a lot of my clients, yes, it's a lot more secure to have SMS-based MFA than having no MFA at all, but SMS-based MFA can be overcome by something called SIM swapping, where a very nice little gentleman will call up your phone company and convince them to swap over your SIM number to their SIM, and then get your multi-factor code sent down to them, where that they can go in and log into the system. So that's where the Google Authenticator and/or the hardware type devices are much more effective for that. So MFA can be run either within the cloud. Microsoft, of course, has MFA. You can turn that on within Azure for your Azure accounts. But there's also an internal Azure MFA server that you can install within your organization. So we've seen some clients also use internal MFA to do things like logging in through VPN. It is a dedicated server, or it can run, you can have it run on your Azure AD Connect machine as well, or it can run specifically on a separate machine. Okay, so one really a nice concept, it's kind of a let's say, I don't want to say cutting edge, but this is going to be the future of how administrators log into things. It's a concept called Privileged Identity Management, or Azure AD PIM. And what it is it's the concept of nobody being an administrator by default, but having to elevate themselves when they need to perform specific tasks. So in a environment that's controlled by PIM, you will have very few people that are, let's say, a global admin at any one time. In fact, usually what you do is you only have 1 or 2 accounts that are permanent global admins that nobody can normally log into. They're only backdoor accounts. And everybody, if they want to go in and, if somebody needs to go in and do global admin, or do SharePoint admin, or do, Power Platform admin, or whatever it is that they're doing, they have to go in and request that through the PIM portal. And then there's a workflow that it goes through where, there can be either a manager or a series of people or a compliance officer that goes in and says, yes, this person is allowed, but they're only going to be allowed for up to 10 hours at a time, at which point they lose those credentials. So if you haven't already played around with PIM, if you haven't had a chance to do that, this is a great concept. The idea with this is that somebody then does get hacked, even if they're an admin, you don't automatically have access to the environment that you don't have access to do the stuff that you would have been able to do if they were a permanent global admin. Now, there actually is a on-prem solution for this as well too, and we do see some organizations using this. I tend to think that it's still at the point where this is a bit too complicated of a solution for a lot of our clients, but I do like the concept. If you look at the concept here of what the Microsoft calls the Bastion environment, I would say that's going to be something that's becoming standard within the next 5 years or so. The idea of the Bastion environment is that your admin accounts actually only exist within the Bastion environment, and the Bastion environment has just a one-way trust in between between the corporate environment and it. So the corporate environment trusts Bastion, but Bastion doesn't entrust the corporate environment. What a tool like MIM does is that it automates adding those admin accounts from the Bastion environments into the groups and the corporate environments that that give you rights to do things. Let's say simplified, like domain admins group. So if I wanted to do something that required domain admin, I would use my Bastion account. I would request within the MIM portal to become a domain admin. It would add me temporarily to the domain admins groups, only, again, for only a short period of time, and then I would be removed automatically. So that concept, again, I think the concept of the Bastion environment will be kind of the default concept moving forward, because it helps to avoid those types of lateral attacks that I mentioned earlier. But again, Microsoft does have a tool. It's a fairly complex tool as of today, and there's some talk about whether or not this will be pulled into being a cloud service in the future. I certainly hope so. Integration with PIM would be fantastic if we have on-prem and Azure-based elevations taking place within the same portal. That's something that I would think would be very useful to most organizations. Okay, Azure Information Protection. This is a set of tools within Azure that controls what happens to the content after it's been accessed. So this allows you to set different information protection tags either automatically, so based on, let's say, certain code words that you have within documents. So if you see, the name of a specific secret project show up within a document, it can automatically do something like encrypt it or automatically keep it from being shared to the outside. And this integrates with things like Azure RMS. And Azure RMS is an interesting service that allows you to then say, okay, well, you can open this document. It's still going to be encrypted, but I'm going to enforce through the client restrictions such as the not being able to copy and paste content, or not being able to print things directly out of those out of that Word document, or out of Outlook. Or in Outlook, it says you can't forward these messages, that type of thing. So that's where Azure Information Protection comes in handy. And every Azure environment has something called the Azure Security Center. And the Azure Security Center actually will give you recommendations of things that you can do to improve your security. I highly recommend you go in and take a look at those recommendations. A lot of them are very useful, good recommendations. And they do have Security Center even on the free tier, but you need to use the standard tier of Security Center if you're doing any type of advanced automation within Security Center. But just take a look at it. At a minimum, take a look at what they call the Secure Score. You can actually just type in securescore.microsoft.com while you're logged into Office 365, and that will tell you what your Secure Score currently is and what you can do to improve that. Okay, I included this slide because it's hard to kind of get this information directly from Microsoft. I do apologize. The licensing, of course, is in US dollars, but you can kind of get a rough idea at the cost of what it might be in zloty. But if you check with the Microsoft Poland, I'm sure they can give you specific numbers on that. And the other caveat I'll say with this is that Microsoft changes their licensing on a regular basis. They're just changing the wording of things now. Recently, Office 365 is becoming Microsoft 365. I do believe on what I've seen so far that most of this still applies. But this gives you an idea of everything that we talked about and what's included within the various SKUs that are out there. The long and short of it is that if you go and buy yourself a Microsoft 365 E5, you're gaining access to the vast majority of these, including your Azure AD Premium P2, your Azure Information Protection P2 licenses. That basically gives you all of the good stuff. So the good stuff, the fun stuff, the ability to do MCAS, ATP, PIM, and PAM, those are available within the E5 licensing, and it's one of the ways that Microsoft tries to push you into using one of those license types. Now, I wanted to show you one more bit in terms of the demo here, And this is really, I talked about the Microsoft Defender ATP operations. One of the reasons that I wanted to show you this is that you can kind of see where Microsoft has gone in here and actually done some attacks against this demo environment. And these attacks have resulted in alerts where I can see, okay, there's some kind of suspicious process that was run on someone's workstation. You know, why was that? You know, what was going on? You know, what's the alert context? Which machine was this run as part of? Who's logged in on that machine? And then you can start to drill into and find more information about that particular user. You'll see this is what they call an EDR, or a defense evasion type of incident. And then you can also then go in and drill into some of the more security recommendations. I talked about secure score. You can see what your secure score is for your organization. These are the different things that it recommends: turning on sensors, you know, turning on Defender Credential Guard, etc. This is, again, specific to Defender Security Center, but if you go into your Azure Security Center, it'll also give you specifics about your entire Azure environment and what you can do within those environments. But this, by the way, this is similar to the Azure Sentinel hunting location, but the Sentinel one has much more built-in categories of things that you want to be looking for. But this will allow you to create different queries to try to look for specific incidents and threats within your organization. So again, just kind of a rough idea. This is, keep in mind, it's a demo environment. There's not much populated within it, but if you do have access to that, it's a useful tool to be able to take a look at that. Okay, I know I don't have much time left, even though it's almost 9 in the morning here. Apparently, there's a SharePint coming up here. Yeah, I may stick to coffee instead of beer, but you never know. So please do use this QR code to fill out feedback. I'm sure the event organizers really appreciate your feedback, so highly recommend you do that. And as well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out. I don't know how questions work or if we can do questions, but we do have just a couple minutes left for questions. So yes, go right ahead.
We have just, I think, just one question from Sarah Davies. Michael, this deep analyze only for EMS E5 plus E5, right?
Yeah. So yeah, if I go back into this here, you can see the E5 is where you change to being able to do things like ATP and MCAS and a lot of those more advanced things. But you can do, you can do a certain amount of things, like even though the base Azure Security Center is built into that, some of the other tools as well around like the password protection bit, MFA, that's still available within an E3.
All right. Any other question, guys? You can unmute yourself and ask direct question. Okay, another question in chat. What is the recommended protection against Mimikatz attack?
So, I mean, Mimikatz is a suite of tools. Primarily, I will say that you will see most of the alerts coming out of the ATP itself. So the ATP agents running in your domain controllers have built-in mechanisms to detect the type of attacks that Mimikatz does. So that's your best tool to be able to protect against Mimikatz. There's some. It will also throw some other. Generally, it's Windows. So Microsoft Defender ATP will also notice when you're doing Mimikatz attacks that are against individual workstations as well too. One of the things that we do at our clients is we do pen tests on a regular basis, and with those tools in place, let's say one client, before we came on board, they did a pen test and nobody noticed a thing, and they managed to completely take over their entire environment. The next year they put in ATP and Defender ATP, and that year we started to get the alert, so much so that I even asked them, I said, listen, I can tell that this must be the pen test. And they said, yeah, it's the pen test. We weren't going to tell you, we wanted to see. And I said, well, do you want me to shut them down or should I let them continue? And they said, well, let them continue. So we actually could have shut down the people doing the penetration test because we noticed them early in advance using the Mimikatz tools and some of these other tools. Any other questions?
Not on chat.
Okay, we can switch. I think it's time anyway, right? You set the SharePoint for the next session.
Yeah, I know it sounds funny for you.
No, it's okay. It's fine. You know, what is it? Airport rules, right? It doesn't. You can drink anytime or something.
Right. So this is a different type of rule right now. We cannot travel, so we can have a beer at least in the morning. All right. So thank you very much, Michael. That was a great presentation. Hopefully the attendees love that. You can write something, guys. Small thank you. All right.
Send it to me on Twitter as well too. You see my Twitter or LinkedIn. You can connect with me. I'm happy to connect with people within the industry on LinkedIn. I've got some links up there, including if you're interested in the travel blog. That by the way, that's a picture of me in Bhutan. I didn't mention it. I'm big into travel, of course. I've been to 175 out of the 193 countries in the world. And I was hoping this year to add another 8 or 9, but of course things have changed a little bit. But please stay safe, everyone. Obviously, there are more important things right now than traveling. Stay safe, and I hope to see you guys after all of this blows over.
Correct, right. All right, so thank you so much. As I said during previous sessions, we are doing recordings. We'll be sending these recordings to you guys, so don't worry. You can watch this session again and again and again. All right, so see you in September, hopefully. Take care. Have a great day, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.